Well, welcome. As Elaine mentioned, tonight's program is kind of a prelude to the two programs we're doing in July. One on the lunar lander, and the second one on the actual anniversary date of the Apollo 11 landing. So tonight I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Apollo 11 program. 50 years of history, the story kind of gets a bit muddled, so hopefully I can clear up a few misconceptions and straighten out some of the details of what happened in 1969. We also have a fairly decent night out there. The moon is visible through the wispy clouds. I'd encourage you to take a look through one of the telescopes after you get out of this talk, because tonight the illumination on the moon is almost identical to that of the July 20th Apollo 11 landing. So the sun is rising on the Sea of Tranquility tonight, and I did take a quick look through one of the telescopes, and you can make out through the clouds the detail on exactly where they landed on that part of the moon. So give it a shot after this talk and take a look through one of the scopes. So the Apollo 11 mission was the culmination of an 8-year effort to answer a challenge that was posed by President Kennedy in May of 1961. When he appeared before Congress and issued this challenge, we had exactly 15 minutes of experience as far as spaceflight. Alan Shepard, the first American to fly, didn't actually go into orbit. It was a suborbital flight. It only lasted 15 minutes. It only went as high as 160 miles. So we didn't have a lot of experience, and yet here is the president giving us a challenge to take that little experience and go to the moon in less than 8 years. Some of the challenges, as you would imagine, we didn't have a rocket that could carry anything into orbit, nevertheless go to the moon. We also needed some kind of spacecraft vehicle that could land on the moon. We had to perfect a skill called rendezvous. We had to be able to meet up two separate spacecraft, dock, exchange crews, do all the functions necessary to execute this very complicated project. We needed new technologies that didn't exist at the time. Manufacturing techniques. We were talking about building something that hadn't been built before. We needed launch facilities. We needed infrastructure, communication worldwide, that we could communicate with spacecraft. We had to be able to navigate across the void of space. And of course we had to coordinate all this. There are also human factors. There were a lot of medical personnel that didn't believe that the human body could survive in weightlessness. So there were many unanswered questions when we initiated this whole program. And of course, there was a time factor. We were given a deadline to get this all done. So a couple of examples. I mentioned Alan Shepard. When he did his suborbital flight, he was riding on top of a Redstone rocket, which was really just a modified Army ballistic missile. We had to take that and scale it up to something that could carry 10 times the payload into orbit and take us all the way to the moon and back. We were also in an era back then where computers were the size of small buildings. So one of the challenges that was taken up by MIT's instrumentation lab was to shrink something the size of a room or multiple rooms down to about a cubic foot. And by the end of the decade, the Apollo guidance computer was about that size, a cubic foot. It weighed about 70 pounds, and it was the most powerful computer as far as navigation on Earth. Back at the beginning of the program, integrated circuits, computer chips were just coming in to play. We were just moving from an era of vacuum tubes. At the height of the Apollo program, NASA was actually consuming 2/3 of the computer chips that were being manufactured in the entire world. So they were cutting edge, and they needed to be so and able to meet the goal. As Elaine mentioned, there were a lot of Connecticut companies involved. There were actually 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians involved in the Apollo program. And these are just some of the Connecticut companies I came across. You're probably very familiar with Pratt & Whitney. They manufactured the fuel cells for the command module and the service module that provided the electricity and the drinking water for the astronauts. Sikorsky, their helicopter picked up the astronauts at the end of the mission. Hamilton Standard, they built the portable life support systems. And on. The contributions from companies, small and large, throughout the nation. It was a national effort. You also needed some place to assemble the rockets and to launch them. And this developed on the northern reaches of Merritt Island, where the Kennedy Space Center was constructed, just north of the Canaveral launch facility. So as you can see in this aerial view, you have the large building in the lower part of the image, and then you've got a crawlerway, and you've got two launch pads, 39A to the south and 39B to the north. And this is where all the action took place during the Apollo era. The Vehicle Assembly Building was one of the largest buildings in the world at the time when it was built, volume-wise. You could actually assemble 4 moon rockets at a time in this building. The doors on the side of the building, the doors are 456 feet tall, and it took 45 minutes to completely open the doors. And this is where the rockets, once assembled, will be rolled out from. This is actually one of the largest flags, painted flags in the world. Those little stars you see are actually, each star is 6 feet across, to give you some sense of scale. So the Saturn V rocket was a 3-stage rocket. It was 363 feet tall, and fully fueled it weighed 6.2 million pounds. It was designed to carry the Apollo spacecraft into orbit and then onto the moon. It took 6 years to perfect, from a paper design to actual launch of the first prototype. And it successfully flew 13 times. So the Saturn V was assembled in that large building we just saw. They would bring in the components by rail, by barge, some by air, some by truck, and they bring it into this one facility where they would bring it all together. There were 3 million parts of this rocket. Of course, it didn't come together all at once, so it was assembled in large components and then brought to the site. So you can see On the left there, that's the first stage with the mighty F1 engines. For scale, you might be able to see a couple of workers standing down here in the left corner. From the base of the engine to the top of the engine is about 19 feet. Give you some perspective. Most powerful engines we've ever built. They would carry that first stage and the entire rocket, that's 6 million pounds. They would carry it to an altitude of 38 miles in just 2.5 minutes. The second stage was powered by 5 smaller J2 engines, and that would carry the remaining rocket to an altitude of about 108 miles. The first stage consumed kerosene. The second stage was hydrogen fueled, both with liquid oxygen. You can see the third stage with a single engine right there being placed on top of the stack. And then on top of the third stage you had an adapter. And inside that adapter was the lunar module. You can see the lunar module with its legs folded in. And then on top of that you would have the command and service module. And this very section right on the top there is the only piece that actually returned to Earth. That is the command module where the 3 astronauts would ride. You can see on the left the stack being put together. You can see right here, this is the adapter. Inside the adapter is the lunar module. So once they got to orbit and on their way to the moon, the command module would separate, turn around, and extract the lunar module from that adapter piece. And the very top, there is a solid rocket escape system. So if anything went wrong during the early stages of launch, that rocket could pull the command module off into safety. So as I mentioned, the whole stack gets built up on a mobile launch pad, and then they have a crawler that moves into the building underneath the launch pad, picks up the entire launch pad and the rocket, and carries it out to the launch pad. This crawler is capable of carrying up to 18 million pounds. It moves at a very tortoise-like 1 mile an hour, and it's able to adjust its deck so that when it climbs up the ramp onto the launch pad, it can keep the whole rocket perfectly level. Apollo 11 was rolled out to the pad while Apollo 10 mission was going on. So Apollo 10 went to the moon. It didn't land, but it did everything but land. And while they were operating around the moon, they moved the Apollo 11 Saturn V out to the launch pad. A little bit about the crew. Of course, these names should be familiar. You had Neil Armstrong, who commanded the mission. You had Michael Collins, who was the command module pilot. And you had Buzz Aldrin on the right there, who was a lunar module pilot. Armstrong, of course, would be the first one to walk on the moon, but it wasn't preordained. He wasn't the first choice. That was probably Gus Grissom, who died in the Apollo 1 fire. Armstrong wasn't even the second choice. Frank Borman, who commanded Apollo 8, was offered the mission. He declined and retired. So Armstrong just happened to be in the right place at the right time. His role in history was also a matter of having survived numerous close calls. So, just to give you a brief overview of his career, that's Armstrong on the right. I know there's some young folks in the room. He just turned 21 when that picture was taken. He started out at Purdue University pursuing a degree in aeronautical engineering under a Navy program. When the Korean War broke out, they called him into service. So he was flying a Grumman Panther off an aircraft carrier, the USS Essex, off North Korea during the Korean War. He flew 78 combat missions. He had just turned 21 in September of 1951 when he was flying a bombing mission over North Korea. He hit a steel cable that had been strung across the valley to try to prevent planes from flying through. It sheared off 6 feet of his wing. He managed to regain control of the aircraft 20 feet above the ground and gain enough altitude to bail out over the coast and get recovered by friendly forces. This is a 21-year-old. So, very competent pilot, very cool under pressure, and those traits would serve him well in the future. But that's just mind-boggling that you've got a 21-year-old out there doing all these things. Mouse is acting up. In March of 1966, Armstrong and David Scott were flying Gemini 8. The mission would be the first time that 2 spacecraft would dock. They were charged with docking with an unmanned spacecraft called Nagina. You can see it right there above the nose of the Gemini spacecraft. They successfully docked with the Agena, and while they were over the Indian Ocean and out of contact with mission control, the 2 spacecraft started to roll. Initially, Armstrong thought that there was something wrong with the Agena, so he undocked, backed off, but the rolling increased. In fact, it got so bad that the Gemini spacecraft was doing a complete roll every second, and it was starting to affect the vision of the astronauts. Armstrong was able to disengage the thrusters on the Gemini by re-energizing a re-entry system. He was able to slow down the roll of the spacecraft. But of course, once he energized the re-entry system, they had to abandon the mission and do an emergency landing. But his cool thinking under pressure was able to save that mission before it got to a point where the astronauts would have been incapacitated. Some people think that if things had gone wrong with Gemini 8 and we lost a crew in space, it would have changed the whole program. We'd already lost a crew on the ground. If we had lost one in space, it might have been much different outcome. In 1968, if you remember, we had Apollo 8 and Apollo 9 missions lined up to fly. They were essentially going to be very similar missions. Different altitude, a few different activities. They were both intended to work with the lunar lander and put it through its paces in Earth orbit. But the lunar lander was behind as far as being ready to fly. So NASA made a decision to fly Apollo 8 to the moon without the lunar lander. Since the original Apollo 8 crew had trained with the lander, NASA decided to swap the two crews, move 9 to 8, 8 to 9, so that the original Apollo 8 crew would still be able to fly when the lander was ready. Why is this relevant? Well, you can see Armstrong was in the backup crew for Apollo 9. The way NASA had worked out the crew selection, that crew could expect, once they were done with their backing up the prime mission, they would skip 2 missions and they would become the prime crew on the 3rd, which means that Armstrong was originally, he would have commanded Apollo 12. When they switched, the prime crews and the backup crews went with the prime crews, Armstrong moved from 12 to commanding 11. Now, the lunar lander, as you'll find out next month, wasn't designed to operate in the Earth's atmosphere. It was a spacecraft, a true spacecraft, designed to operate in lunar orbit and on the moon. So they came up with this trainer to simulate the lunar lander. Essentially, the astronaut sat on a large jet engine that simulated the weight of the lunar lander in a low gravity environment. In May of '69, just 2 months before Apollo 11 launched, Armstrong's out training in the lunar landing research vehicle, and the controls malfunction. And he is able to eject just 200 feet off the ground and survive. Once everybody heard about the accident, of course, everybody was looking for Armstrong. They eventually found him in his office doing paperwork. Just another indication of how cool under pressure he was. So let's fast forward. July 16th, 1969. Sun's coming up. The Saturn V has been fueled, almost 1 million gallons of fuel in that monster. There's enough explosive power of a small atomic bomb. And the very top, of course, that's where the astronauts would ride. So Armstrong arrives first, a little before 7. He gets into the left seat, that's where the commander sits. He's followed by Michael Collins in the right seat, and Buzz Aldrin in the center seat. So it's about 2.5 hours before launch. Launch proceeds fairly smoothly. The moon rose about a little after 8 that morning. It was only a 2-day-old moon. The landing site in the Sea of Tranquility was still in darkness. Of course, that's part of the timing. They'd want to land at the landing site on the moon right after sunrise or shortly thereafter. About 9 seconds before liftoff, the Saturn V really becomes alive. You really start feeling the pumps kick in. The turbo pumps are starting to push fuel through the big F1 engines. First they light the center engine, number 5. Then they About a second later, they light engines 2 and 4, and then 1 and 3. So right before liftoff, all engines are running at full power, and they're straining against the hold down arms of the launch pad. Whoops. Took about 10 seconds for that Saturn V to clear the pad. It's a very slow methodical launch. So here's the challenge. Of course, launching is one part of the process. Once you're into orbit, the spacecraft is checked out over a period of 2 orbits, and then there's a go, no-go to go to the moon. At that point, the engine on the 3rd stage is relit, and it pushes the spacecraft out of Earth orbit into a velocity where it can escape the gravitational pull of the Earth. So on that day, the moon was about 240,000 miles away. Now, the moon is moving. The moon moves about 2,300 miles an hour, or about 38 miles a minute. So the challenge here is to arrive at a point in space about 69 miles in front of the moon in 3 days, which is why the Apollo navigation computer was such an important piece of the mission. If you arrive too early, you'll miss the moon, and if you arrive too late, there's certainly other consequences. So tonight, this is roughly what you'd see after this talk. You go outside and take a look through one of the scopes. It's about a 5.5 day old moon, 5.5 days after the new moon. The Sea of Tranquility, or Mare Tranquillitatis, is this irregular shaped lava patch right here. Okay? And what you want to look for when you find that is the area closest to the line that separates the night from the day is called the terminator. If you look along that line tonight, you want to look for these 2 craters here. This is Sabine and this is Ritter. They're both about 18 miles in diameter. You go further to the east, you see this bright small crater here, Mulkey. About halfway in between is where the Apollo 11 astronauts landed 50 years ago. So I checked the scope out on the deck, and it's very easy to find these 2 craters on the western shore of the Sea of Tranquility. So you shouldn't have too much trouble once you get oriented on finding the landing area. The Sea of Tranquility was selected because it was relatively smooth. It was fairly close to the equator, which means it conserved fuel. Higher latitude landing sites would have consumed more fuel. There was good communications with the Earth because it was on the equator. And the illumination would be good for the astronauts when they arrived. So on July 20th, 3 days after they had launched, the astronauts climbed through a tunnel in the command module into the lunar module, and Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar lander and left Michael Collins to do the housekeeping on the command module while they made an approach to the landing site. You've probably heard that the landing was a little bit tense because there were several alarms on the way down, starting around 6,000 feet. Actually, there were 5 alarms, mostly of the 1201 and 1202 variety. There was also concern that they were running low on fuel. Um, the alarms, they were of a concern. The astronauts were not familiar with the alarms per se, but there really wasn't a need to abort the landing because of the alarms. You might have heard stories where Steve Bales, who was a 26-year-old guidance officer, kept telling flight, "We're go, ignore the alarm, we're go, it's good." Bales was actually getting that information from someone else in the back room. But the real person that potentially saved this mission was Gene Kranz, who you see on the left. Now, Gene is famous for Apollo 13 because he said failure is not an option. But he was a flight director here at this stage of Apollo 11. And he had told these guidance folks that he wanted them to write down every single alarm that could possibly go wrong on the landing, and to know what each alarm meant and whether it was serious or not. So it was really Krantz that had the forethought to make sure that they knew exactly what the response would be to any particular situation. The other person that should get some credit would be Margaret Hamilton on the right. Her team was responsible for writing the software. And actually the software was fairly elegant. Those alarms were telling the astronauts that the computer had too many different things to do. And what it was doing was it was shutting down non-important tasks. So the computer was doing everything it was supposed to do. The software had been written that it wasn't going to crash because it had too much to do. It was just going to prioritize the various tasks and say this is important and this isn't. Turns out the real problem was there was an error in the checklist for the landing, and the astronauts following the checklist had put the rendezvous radar in the wrong position, the switch in the wrong position. So the computer was being told not only to work the landing, but also to work rendezvous tasks that had no importance whatsoever at that stage of the mission. So the software was written well enough that it could ignore those non-important tasks. So the fuel was a consideration. We really don't know how much fuel was left when they landed. We hear Buzz Aldrin call out 5% fuel left, about 100 feet above the ground. But the design of the fuel tank was such that the fuel would slosh around. I believe there were modifications later on to that. But so if the fuel sloshes, it could uncover the low fuel sensor. So they weren't really sure how much fuel they had left, but it probably somewhere between 20 and 40 seconds, which would be plenty of time for someone of Armstrong's skill to find a smooth place to put down. So Armstrong and Aldrin land on the moon. For the first 2 hours or so, they are preparing the lunar lander to leave. Just in case, they want to make sure that all systems are ready to leave at a moment's notice. Once that is done, they're pretty anxious to get out on the surface. Of course, you know Armstrong exits the lunar module first. He never really expressed an interest in who would go first, unlike Buzz Aldrin, who was very clear on who he thought should go first, and he told everybody and anybody. So Armstrong goes down the ladder and puts his left foot first onto the lunar surface, and then of course he takes a walk around, gets a feel of the environment. First thing he really does is collects what they call a contingency sample. Picks up some rocks, some soil, just in case they have to leave quickly. Aldrin then follows Armstrong down about 15 minutes later, and they go about setting up some science equipment they had brought with them. First thing they set up is a TV camera. This is connected to the lunar module by a long 100-foot cable. So it's about 80 foot where they set the camera up. Then they set up a solar wind experiment. This is something that actually came back to Earth. They set it out to collect charged particles that are flowing from the sun. And then before they left, they rolled up there was a foil and brought it back to be analyzed. While we're looking at this picture, you might notice it doesn't feel natural in some cases. The shadows are inky black. Unlike Earth, the shadows are softened by scattered light. On the moon, it's either sunlight or it's almost absolute black. The sky is black. You don't see the stars because the glare, the harsh sunlight off the surface is too bright. If you actually stepped into the shadows, the astronauts reporting being able to see the stars. The horizon, the moon is a little over a quarter the size of the Earth. So the horizon is much closer. In this picture, the horizon's only about 1.5 miles away. Very close. So it gives you this unnatural sense. They set the American flag up. They had a hard time. One, they couldn't get it all unfolded, probably working with these very bulky big gloves. The other part is they could get the pole only in a few inches. Then the lunar soil was so compacted they couldn't drive the pole in any further, which is why we believe this is the one flag that didn't survive. Because Aldrin report that he saw it out his window as being knocked over by the exhaust. So it really wasn't planted very deeply, and it was very close. A lot of stories about the flag. A lot of conflicting stories about where the flag came from. Did it come from Sears, where most of the stories diverge? Or was it a mail order flag? But it was a last-minute addition to the mission. You can see Aldrin, he's setting up a couple of science experiments. In his left hand, he's carrying a seismometer, essentially, to record moonquakes. And he has just dropped off a retroreflector, which was actually designed and built down in Danbury at Perkin-Elmer at that time. So you can see the retroreflector here. It's basically a matrix of prisms that we still use today to bounce lasers off of, and by doing so we can get an accurate measurement of the distance between the Earth and the Moon. So that is something that we still use on a regular basis. There's the passive seismic, the seismometer being set up by Aldrin with solar panels. He's operated for several years and recorded thousands of moonquakes, which are just now being looked at again. There's the famous picture of Aldrin on the surface, and in the reflection of the gold covering on his helmet, you can see Armstrong. Now, A lot of people don't think there were many pictures of Armstrong on the surface. Well, there weren't, because in most cases he had the camera. But there are a few. There was a camera mounted in the window of the lunar module. It's a 16 millimeter camera. So you can see Armstrong on the surface there. It doesn't even, you can actually see his face. He doesn't have his visor down. And on the right, you can see him storing some samples that Aldrin happened to catch when he took a panorama. Here's Armstrong and Aldrin trying to set the flag up. And then you can also see they captured the Earth. There's the Earth there. A waning gibbous Earth in the lunar sky, about 60 degrees above the western horizon. This is as far as Armstrong traveled from the lunar module, about 190 feet. He took a quick jaunt out to a crater called Little West, where he took a panorama. So what I did is I put all his travels and those of Aldrin's on a scale that you might find familiar. This is the football field right behind us. So you can see the furthest that Armstrong traveled was still inside the confines of the football field. This was a very short-term stay on the moon. They were trying to meet Kennedy's goal, get there, and get home safely. So there wasn't a lot of time spent on the surface. They did leave some science experiments, collected about 48 pounds of rock and material, and really that wrapped up the mission. At that point, they both re-entered the lunar lander, and as you'll find out next month, the ascent stage, or the top half of the lunar lander, uses the bottom half as a launching pad and returned to orbit. So you can see that Michael Collins gets a glimpse of it coming up as they're ready to rendezvous, and at that point dock, transfer the material that they collected into the command module, and the two astronauts would join Michael Collins, and then they would undock from the lunar lander, and that would be left behind. The trip back was relatively uneventful, and the recovery was in the Pacific Ocean. They landed about 3 miles from the aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. At that point, they had to spend several weeks in quarantine because we didn't know that if they brought back anything contagious. So it was a few missions before they dropped that protocol. So if you're interested in seeing what the Apollo landing site looks like today, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is in orbit around the moon, this is an image taken from about 15 miles above the surface. So you can see where the astronauts walked on the surface. They disturbed the surface enough so that their tracks are visible. You can see Little West, where Armstrong took a walk to. You can see where they set the camera up and the equipment they left on the surface. Okay, just to wrap up real quick, because I spent way too much time talking about this. Like I mentioned, they brought it back about 48 pounds of lunar sample, comprised of breccias, which are really rocks that have been fused together by impacts. Impact glass, that's roughly soil that's been melted into a glass. Igneous rocks, which you would expect that from a lava plain where they landed. And interesting enough, they brought back little quantities of a northite. Northite is a calcium rich, aluminum rich mineral. We don't find a lot of it on Earth. Turns out that the moon's crust has quite a bit of this mineral in it. And that revolutionized our whole thinking of how the moon formed. A retroreflector also gave us a lot of information about the moon, how far it is from the Earth, the fact that it's receding about 1.5 inches every year. So billions of years ago, it must have been much closer. The passive seismic experiment recorded thousands of small little moonquakes. We're now relating those moonquakes to other features in the moon that look like fault lines. And we actually think that the moon is not a dead body that we had conceived it to be. It's actually still undergoing cooling, shrinking, and transformation. And all this science is coming out of the Apollo samples. Almost as important is that we learned a lot about the Earth. We got a totally different perspective of the Earth. No longer was it something that was in isolation. It was essentially all of humanity. Everything was in that little blue marble. And in some cases, it triggered a realization, and the environmental movement was really boosted by the fact that we really have to care for the one and only place that we know that we can live on. Quick step back. I mean, it took a lot of resources and dedication and sacrifice. It's one of the greatest technological achievements that in history. It launched a technological and industrial revolution that we are still benefiting from today. And it advanced lunar science and provided a very unique perspective of the Earth. So, as I conclude, I'm going to reinforce what Elaine mentioned. Next month, second Saturday, very distinguished speaker who is involved in building of this moonship. I'm sure you're not going to get an opportunity very often to hear somebody who was on the front line. Okay, so come and hear Peter's first-hand account of how they built this very unique, one-of-a-kind spacecraft. And then the following week on the 20th, the actual anniversary, we're going to have a celebration here in the daytime, 12 to 3, and you can find more details out front about some of the activities we have planned. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and please take a look at the moon through one of the telescopes if it's still clear enough out there. Thank you.
Thank you.